of photos because I think it's a very beautiful area, so just put some photos up. But what I'm going to say today is very much a continuation of what Rachel and Paul talked about going into areas of live conflict in particular. And of course this idea of that ethnography is using yourself as the instrument of study, and then therefore what happens to yourself mentally, emotionally, and existentially as well has an influence on the quality of your research and on this ethical question of the relation with the people you interview and the environment you come into. So what I'm going to talk about is, first of all, the challenges themselves, the physical, mental, and existential challenges that you face. And I'm then going to talk about this question of the ethical interaction with the person you're dealing with, the people you're dealing with. I don't know if this can flip automatically so you can have some nice photos. Just going through, but anyways. So, I only have a relatively short experience of conducting this type of field research. I spent 8 months in South Kivu in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is an active conflict zone has been for the last 20 years. And I'm going back there in a month, so I'm going to continue doing field work there. And most of the time I did not spend, actually I spent quite a bit of time in the cities, which are very different than when you're going out into the rural areas. It's very important where you are in those situations. I always find it a bit funny how one defines the field, because there is this notion, of course, of a field in social sciences and humanities, and it's a bit the way in which researchers and other actors derive their legitimacy about talking about something. Where is the field, in a sense? Is it just going to Eastern Congo? Is it getting out of the cities? Then there are certain areas which are considered, more legitimate in terms of research, and you have this entire scale of legitimacy that sets itself in communities of researchers and humanitarians. And it can be a bit ridiculous, but what I do think that it points to is that different levels of exposure, that physical and mental exposure that you are prepared to set yourself into. So, without going into the detail of it, I think that this particular region, Eastern Congo, is actually quite a safe place, I would say. Not for the Congolese themselves, of course, but for yourself as a researcher. And I think there are two big reasons for that. First of all, the nature of the conflict, the way you, as an external, a Western, of course, and white person arrive there, are not directly framed in relation to the conflict. Not directly in relation to the causes of the violence. And that, of course, can change extremely quickly, but I think it makes it much more easy to conduct research in such an area than to conduct research in areas like Afghanistan, although I've never been there, or currently the conflict that is happening in the Sahel, which is very much where you're very much more considered as a legitimate target by various armed actors. This is, of course, something very important to take into account when you're doing your research. The second reason I think it's not such a dangerous area to go into is, of course, the presence of what I would call the full-fledged United Nations and humanitarian industry, which is there. It's really one of these contact zones that you were talking about before, and there's so much money channeled through this industry, and it has so deeply reorganized economic and social lives that you're associated with this industry, and as such you have considerable power over there in your interactions with local people. This is of course true in many places in Africa where you have bigger purchasing power than local people, and you have very little social ties, so you have this kind of feeling of power and freedom, which also has historical roots, which is problematic. I'm not saying that it's good, but you have to take it into account. But I've never seen such a place where it's so strong as in Eastern Congo, this kind of association of yourself as an external person with power of various sorts. But of course this is highly relative, and it can change extremely quickly, and that's one of the difficulties of negotiating these areas. It depends on where you are, it depends on what time, what period you are there For example, currently in Goma, the situation is becoming much more difficult. Even in this very protected city for Westerners, there is much more violence directed towards the NGOs and people who are associated as coming from the outside. So it changes a lot, and it depends, of course, on the means you have. Your insurance, your emergency repatriation plans, your communication devices, your transport, the money you have. All of these are extremely important in your positionality in those regions. And as a researcher, especially if you go out of the cities into areas where there's live conflict, and I do research on armed groups, so I try to enter milieux where the armed groups are active and recruiting and carrying out violence. And you can be quite significantly exposed, but I think I've seen several points of view. I've worked on projects where I was based a bit in Bukavu, where you have considerable security, and I've been really in areas where there was no possibility to communicate. The closest town was maybe 10 hours away by motorcycle in the mountains, so very different things. And what I would like to talk about today is the challenges first, of course, which are physical. Obviously, traveling by motorcycle in mountains or in jungles can be quite physically challenging. There's all these food questions that people who have traveled in such areas know. And your constant, and the other challenge is logistical. You always have to be extremely mobile, especially if you're on your own. You have to be able to get out of a place extremely quickly. And that means paying constant attention to transport, for example. But more importantly for our topic today, I would say that it's challenging mentally. All these things are challenging mentally, cognitively, and emotionally. Why? Well, because of course you have to deploy considerable efforts to read the signs. And of course you're not used to the signs because you're not in your natural context. You don't know the area very well. And because of the shifting nature of violence, interpreting these signs can be extremely tricky. The exact same situation, being arrested by military, for example, at a checkpoint for a while, can become dangerous or can be perfectly harmless for you as an external researcher. So you do have to constantly be aware of these questions, and this occupies an extremely large part of your mental space, I would say, when you're in those areas. And not only do you have to deploy efforts to read the signs, you have to deploy efforts to control the signs that you yourself are emitting, in the sense that people will, especially in places where there is mining activity, which is one of the areas I work in, or with high military activity, you'll constantly be challenged on your identity, on your motives, on these different questions, and just negotiating the discourse that you produce to the actors you encounter is quite challenging, because you always, of course, have to be extremely honest in the presentation of your research, but depending on the different actors, you have to emphasize certain areas of your research. Especially in my case, I work on armed groups, and if I'm arrested by military, I cannot directly say I'm working on the armed groups. So, and you also have to deploy effort in certain situations to reduce tensions, and this humor can be one of the ways you can do this, and I noticed that it worked extremely well, but of course it depends if the people are receptive upon the humor. In the particular case of the Congolese, they're actually they have a very strong humor, so they're very receptive to that. And I developed actually jokes that were really able to reduce tensions in those cases. But, I mean, this is anecdotal in a sense, but it more generally, it's about being able to not close off discussions, especially when you're in a situation where you're dealing with armed actors directly. So all these efforts are quite tiring and stressful, I would say. And of course they also have a lot to do with your own perception of the risk. Most of the time, as I was saying, you're not directly... 5 minutes. Okay, so generally what it does, all these efforts, they tend to completely shut you off. That's what I noticed. And really, it's a normal reaction in a sense of self-preservation, but the problem is that you really formulate at one point to yourself, in these interactions, you say, okay, I have to get as much as I can and I have to get out of here. And this is something that really comes extremely naturally, and it's problematic because it will affect the quality of your research, and it will also affect, of course, the ethical relation that you have with people who are there, I would say. So this ethical question we've been talking about today already is, of course, not limited to these types of situations, but it's much stronger when you're talking to very vulnerable populations or people who are suffering direct types of violence while you're even speaking to them. And so just about the ethical question, I think it's a question of the exchange. First of all, the fact that you're extracting information and that you're going to produce something out of it, which is maybe social capital or academic capital or whatever. And on the other hand, the fact that the people who are there are very conscious that you're getting something out of it, but they're going to ask you very directly, what do I get in exchange? And it's a very legitimate question, of course, on their part. And without, I don't have time to go into the big debate about the usefulness or the impact of academic research, but for me, the big argumentative loop that goes from this research is going to influence policy, is going to influence, and all that doesn't work in those kinds of direct situations. Although I'm not saying that certain projects which are more directly associated with projects cannot use this line of argumentation, but in my case I felt that it was particularly dishonest to sell this type of line. So what do you do, coming back to this question of the exchange, there is a sense, of course, that both from your position and from the position of the person you're talking to or engaging with, that this exchange has to be to a certain extent fair. And in those particular situations, I would think that the fairest exchange would actually be a monetary one, because the person who is in front of you is facing extremely strong constraints, and the only thing that can actually help them out in the same way that he's helping you out is money. And I think it's actually perfectly justified in certain contexts, although it creates bad expectancies and bad practices for researchers to come. But it's problematic. And so the thing that this ethical question, I don't think there is a resolution, and I don't want to propose that building friendships and all that is a resolution to any of that. But because you're under this extreme mental strain, you do have to make a particular effort to displace or to not just engage with people on this level of the academic exchange, in the sense of this research extraction that's happening. And that is something that we do naturally in various contexts, but because you're in a situation where you're afraid and you want to get out, you're not going to do it naturally, so you have to kind of push yourself, and it becomes something that you really have to prepare yourself for. And I know it can sound a bit obvious and also quite naive, and it's obviously not possible to make friends with everybody, and it depends with your own affinities and the people you're meeting with, especially if you're talking to military actors. Which was not my case, but as much as you can, you have to make this effort to actually engage with them on this non-strictly academic, I would say, level. And this, of course, has a lot to do with what we were talking before, which is trust, but not just in an instrumental perspective, that is creating, a nice configuration for the exchange to happen, but in a long-term perspective, as much as you can, the ethical engagement with the people you're talking to, I think, is to sustain or develop as much as you can various types of friendships. And that is actually hard, especially when you get out of this context, when you come back to Europe, when you come back to London or wherever. The people you have met there, especially if they're armed actors or engaged in militias, their life is completely different than yours, and this kind of friendship that you created at that moment, how does that really translate in later phases? How do you and that's an effort, and that's, I think, an ethical engagement, which is very important to do. And it also means that you have to change your schedule. If you have, it depends on what type of research you're doing, of course, but if you have a large set of interviews, what happened to me, for example, I arrived in certain areas, like in this area, and I wanted to do a very large number of interviews. I was working with an interpreter, but then I realized that I was getting nowhere with that because people were extremely distrustful or engaging with me only on the level of this exchange. So what I did is really decided to, instead of do fill out all my schedule of interviews. I just decided to stay there for 3 weeks and, you know, spend some time with the people. So this, I mean, in terms of organizing your research, it has profound consequence. Okay, I'm stopping.